There is a moment in certain relationships that is almost impossible to detect in real time. Nothing dramatic happens on the surface. There is no clear argument, no visible betrayal, no obvious ending, and yet something has already shifted. The connection feels different, subtly colder, slightly distant, harder to reach. What most people don't realize is that, in some cases, the relationship has already ended, just not in the way they expect. It ended internally, long before anything changed externally. This is one of the most unsettling dynamics associated with narcissistic patterns: the tendency to mentally replace a partner before physically leaving them. It is not always conscious, not always calculated in a strategic sense, but it follows a recognizable psychological pattern. And once you understand that pattern, many confusing behaviors begin to make sense. At the core of this dynamic is not simply disinterest or boredom. It is a deeper mechanism tied to how certain individuals regulate their sense of self. For someone with strong narcissistic tendencies, relationships are not just about connection. They are also about reinforcement. The partner becomes part of a system that stabilizes identity, provides validation, and maintains a desired self-image. When that system begins to weaken, whether due to conflict, familiarity, unmet expectations, or internal restlessness, the response is rarely direct confrontation or honest disengagement. Instead, the shift happens internally first. Attention begins to move elsewhere. Not always in a fully committed way, but in fragments. Curiosity about others increases. Comparisons begin to form. Alternative possibilities are entertained. These are not necessarily acted upon immediately, but they are rehearsed mentally. The individual starts constructing what can be described as a parallel narrative, one in which a different partner, a different dynamic, or a different version of themselves exists. This is where the idea of mental replacement becomes relevant. The current partner is still present, still involved, still interacting, but psychologically, they are no longer occupying the same position. Their role is gradually being downgraded, even if no explicit conversation has taken place. Emotional investment becomes inconsistent. Moments of closeness may still occur, but they are often followed by withdrawal. Communication becomes less engaged, more functional, sometimes even performative. From the outside, this inconsistency is confusing. It creates a push-pull dynamic that can be difficult to interpret. One moment, there is warmth. The next, there is distance. Attempts to address the change may be met with deflection, minimization, or vague explanations. The relationship appears intact, but the underlying structure is no longer stable. What is happening beneath the surface is a form of psychological transition. Instead of ending one relationship before beginning another, either emotionally or physically, the individual begins shifting attachment in advance. This reduces the emotional cost of separation. By the time the relationship officially ends, much of the internal detachment has already occurred. From their perspective, this creates a sense of continuity. There is no prolonged period of loss or emptiness because a new source of engagement is already partially established. From the partner's perspective, however, the experience is very different. The ending feels abrupt, disproportionate, and difficult to process. It raises questions that seem to have no clear answers. How did things change so quickly? When did the disconnection actually begin? Was any of it genuine? These questions are not irrational. They arise because the visible timeline does not match the internal one. To understand why this pattern occurs, it is necessary to look at the role of validation. For individuals with pronounced narcissistic traits, external validation functions as a regulatory mechanism. It supports self-worth, reinforces identity, and buffers against internal instability. When validation from a current partner becomes less consistent or less effective, there is often an increased sensitivity to alternative sources. This does not necessarily mean the partner has done something wrong. In many cases, it reflects a shift in internal needs rather than external reality. Familiarity, for example, can reduce the intensity of validation. What was once exciting becomes predictable. What once felt affirming becomes expected. Over time, the same input produces diminishing psychological returns. Rather than addressing this directly, the individual may begin seeking novelty. New attention, new admiration, or even the possibility of it can feel revitalizing. It reintroduces uncertainty, and with it, a renewed sense of self-expansion. The idea of someone new becomes less about the person themselves and more about what they represent. A reset, a fresh source of validation, a different mirror. This is where monkey branching behavior often emerges, though not always in a visible or overt way at first. The individual begins to secure psychological footing elsewhere before releasing their current attachment. Like moving from one branch to another, they do not let go until they feel something else is within reach. Importantly, this process is often gradual. It does not begin with a decision to replace someone. It begins with small shifts in attention and investment. Over time, those shifts accumulate. Emotional energy is redistributed. The center of gravity in the relationship moves. Meanwhile, the partner may still be operating under the assumption that the relationship is intact. They may notice changes, but interpret them as temporary or situational. They may try to reconnect, to communicate, to repair. In doing so, they often invest more effort at the exact moment the other person is investing less. This asymmetry creates further imbalance. One person is trying to stabilize the connection. The other is already adapting to its eventual absence. When the relationship finally ends, whether through a breakup, withdrawal, or a shift toward someone else, the outcome feels sudden. But in reality, it is the visible conclusion of an invisible process that has been unfolding for some time. Understanding this dynamic is not about assigning labels or making absolute judgments about individuals. It is about recognizing patterns of behavior that can otherwise be difficult to interpret. When viewed through this lens, certain inconsistencies begin to align. The mixed signals, the emotional fluctuations, the unexplained distance, they are not random. They are indicators of a transition already in progress. This recognition has practical implications. It shifts the focus from trying to decode every individual behavior to observing broader patterns over time. It encourages attention to consistency rather than isolated moments. It highlights the importance of emotional reciprocity as a key indicator of relational stability. If investment becomes consistently one-sided, if communication becomes increasingly superficial, if attempts at connection are repeatedly deflected, these are not minor issues. They may signal a deeper shift that is not being addressed directly. At the same time, it is important to avoid overgeneralization. Not every instance of emotional distance indicates replacement. Not every fluctuation reflects a hidden transition. Human relationships are inherently dynamic, and periods of disconnection can occur for many reasons. The distinction lies in pattern and persistence. Temporary distance tends to resolve with communication and effort. Structural detachment tends to deepen despite it. Recognizing this difference requires both observation and restraint. It involves resisting the urge to immediately define the situation, while also remaining attentive to what is consistently unfolding. It requires balancing openness with discernment. Ultimately, the most important shift is internal. Instead of focusing exclusively on what the other person is doing or not doing, attention returns to what is being experienced. Is there mutual engagement? Is there responsiveness? Is there a sense of presence in the interaction? These questions are often more informative than any specific label, because at the end of the day, the most reliable indicator of a relationship's state is not what is said about it, but how it functions. If the connection feels increasingly one-sided, if emotional availability becomes inconsistent, if clarity is replaced by confusion, these are not details to be dismissed. They are data. And data, when observed over time, reveals patterns. Understanding those patterns does not eliminate the emotional impact of a relationship ending in this way. It does not remove the sense of loss or the difficulty of processing what happened. But it does provide context. It replaces confusion with structure. It allows for a more accurate interpretation of events. And with accurate interpretation comes a different kind of closure, not one based on explanations given after the fact, but one grounded in recognizing what was already happening before it was ever made explicit. Because sometimes the most important part of a relationship is not how it ends, but when it actually ended. And in these cases, that moment often comes much earlier than anyone expects.